Hi everyone, my name is Surina. You are watching Now It's So Vivid. Today I'm going to be discussing tarot in my magical practice. This is going to be the first of a small series of videos on tarot where I discuss certain talking points, and I'm going to try to break them up into different chunks that are sort of relevant to each. And the first is going to be me discussing the history of tarot as I have learned it thus far, what constitutes a tarot deck in my opinion, where I think you should get started if you're brand new to tarot, and my personal approach in studying tarot. So I'm going to give you a very brief synopsis of tarot history. It's very long and very nuanced, so I'm just going to try to break it down to some basic bullet points. These are not going to be, 100% accurate, and they're certainly not going to be as detailed as tarot history truly is, because it has migrated a lot within European cultures and elsewhere. So we have a lot to cover, but we're going to try to do it in as much brevity as possible. So the story of tarot begins in medieval Europe, after European cultures were introduced to playing cards from Islamic cultures, I think. And over time there developed a game where a fifth suit was added to a deck of playing cards, ordinary playing cards, and that fifth suit was the triumphs, or the trump cards. And there was this game that was developed where I'm sure the trump cards would, as you would expect, be the heavy hitters and triumph over the other cards. I'm not exactly sure how the game itself was played. I don't know that anyone exactly knows, but I don't think it really matters. That's kind of just what we need to know to understand the root of where tarot came from. So we can assume over time that it became a divinatory tool, which I'll just take a little break here and say that the fact that tarot is a tool used for divination is not particularly remarkable about it, in my opinion. I think it makes an excellent divinatory tool because of its strengths, but the fact that we have, sought to use something rather mundane in a very spiritual way is a very natural human inclination. We have been doing it for centuries with things like bones and stones and smoke and fire and you name it. We have tried to use it to communicate with the spirit realm, and tarot is absolutely no exception. But like I said, I do think that it has its strengths over some other methods of divination, particularly because of how image heavy it is, but I'll get to that in a minute. So tarot was a popular game, or taroki, or triumphi, whatever it was called. It was a popular game among sort of the affluent families of sort of Renaissance Europe, and particularly Italy, and they would commission these grand, beautiful decks by artists of the day. And there was this parlor game called Triumphi Appropriati. I'm sorry, I know I'm Italian, but I can't pronounce Italian words worth a damn. I was better at German in high school, so this is gonna come out kind of clunky. But yeah, Triumphi Appropriati was this game that was played by sort of like affluent Italian families, where they would draw a few cards at random, and then based on the images on the cards create a story. And I love that exercise. It's something that I actually do in my own life, and did before I learned of this, especially if I'm feeling stuck, and especially when I was doing more writing than painting. But I used to love drawing tarot cards to help me sort of like get out of writer's block, and it's really great. I just love that as an exercise, so it tickles me pink to know that my Italian ancestors did this. So that sort of developed it in in a very relatable way, I think, where it wasn't simply a deck of playing cards. It now had more personality to it, and I think that kind of strengthened its sort of birth as a divinatory tool as well, because people can find some really creative universal connections to the pictures on the cards through sort of the everyday workings of their imagination. So I know that tarot was not strictly for the wealthy. Lower class people did play it, but I do think that it gained a greater popularity among the lower classes when it started being more widely mass produced after migrating into France. I think the French were the first that kind of, created tarot as an easily producible deck to be given out to, the world at large. And the Tarot de Marseille, which was kind of like the Rider-Waite-Smith of its day, has some very specific symbolism. A lot of the images in the cards are very different from how we think of Rider-Waite-Smith symbolism of certain cards. I know there are a few in there that are totally unto themselves, and even sort of like earlier interpretations of tarot did not all look exactly the same. They had, they were largely similar in terms of like the key players in the trump cards, but for the most part, I think people were very willing to play back then. I've even seen some earlier decks that had pagan gods in them instead of the more Roman Catholic characters that we usually think of as showing up. But yes, Tarot de Marseille gave tarot an even greater popularity than it already had, and sort of after centuries of playing with it and using it to commune with the spirit world, people started deliberately assigning esoteric meaning to the cards. And I'm thinking about sort of the writers in the Victorian period like Eliphas Levi, occultists within Europe that really sought to draw these metaphorical parallels between tarot symbolism and things like astrology, numerology, Kabbalah, all of these sort of mystical systems that were sort of floating around at the time, especially in sort of retaliation against the very highly logicized Renaissance period, and wrote books on them to make them official, and made some very wild claims also about their origins too. There's a lot of hot debate around that. We don't exactly know if tarot is exactly derived from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. I don't really care if it is or not. It would be cool if it was, but it doesn't diminish its use or its importance to me if it's not. I just think it's really interesting that there was a decision made somewhere in that time period where, we have been using this thing as a spiritual tool, so we are going to make it deliberately spiritual. So that came out of Europe, and then sometime later we get the tarot decks that we are probably most familiar with now, sort of derived in the English schools of mysticism, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn being probably the most prominent, where they had made some major switches and sort of adjusted things to their particular tastes. I'm thinking, of course, of the 8-11 switch is one of them. That's where, prior to the Golden Dawn getting their fingers in it, tarot had the Justice card as number 8 and the Strength card as number 11, and the Golden Dawn switched that around to put them more in the order of the symbols of astrology. Yeah, it was supposed to be Strength right after the Chariot, which is Cancer, and then Strength is Leo, and then later on Justice is Libra. So yeah, anyway, sorry, got a little tangential there. But from the Golden Dawn is where we derive the decks that we're most familiar with now, particularly the Rider-Waite-Smith, which was developed by Arthur Edward Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith. Why everybody had 3 names back then, I have no idea, if it is popular. And some decades later, we get the Thoth Tarot, which was created by Aleister Crowley and the artist Lady Frida Harris. Yeah, I really love that, the point of tarot is not in one system is more legitimate than the other. It's really that everybody has done exactly the same thing, thinking they had fixed tarot by assigning their own personal symbolism to it. And that's really the point, you know what I mean? Like, it's open to interpretation. It's always open to, becoming more relatable to someone if it isn't already. And it's easily done because all we have to do is draw the pictures that we want to see. I know a lot of people find that particular aspect of tarot frustrating, and if you're an occult student and your foundations are sort of based in this one area, I can see why that could be a struggle, but I personally relish in it. So I guess that's where I officially weigh in on that. One of the things that I love about tarot is that it really doesn't matter what's on the cards. It's the feelings that it invokes with us all, and it is universal. It just may not be as easily accessible to some using kind of like outdated symbolism, and to others they really feel the connection that way. So it's entirely subjective, and they're all perfectly legitimate, every single one. So yeah. Anyway, that helps me sort of segue into the second point of this video. What constitutes a tarot deck according to Surina? Well, considering that tarot hasn't really ever truly set in stone, like it's sort of changed gradually with time, but like I said, I think the point is that everybody thinks that they can fix tarot or they can adjust it to their own particular needs, and maybe for that reason I tend to be quite lenient in my personal prerequisite for what makes a tarot deck. I had a conversation online with some people in a tarot Facebook group, and we were trying to like suss out, what actually makes tarot. Does it have to be exactly 78 cards? Does it have to have these exact suits? Does it have, these exact figures that, show up in the major arcana and the court cards? Do each of the, do the cards need to have the same meaning throughout the minor arcana? Can people like switch things around and do what they want? Where does the line get drawn between tarot and an oracle deck, or other things like Lenormand decks, which is a subject for another day. I think that the only thing that truly makes a tarot deck is that it has to have suits, and at least one of them has to be a trump suit, and that's it. I think everything else is just kind of up to interpretation, extra. You know what I mean? Not everybody associates the 4 remaining suits with the 4 cardinal elements the way that occultists have throughout the centuries. Like that's not a requirement in my mind for tarot. Tarot just has to be a deck of cards with several suits, and at least one of them has to be a trump suit, and that's pretty much it. That gives a lot of people the freedom of sort of creating their own thing and having it qualify as tarot without any sort of puritanism about it, because I personally don't think that everything has to be exactly the same, but really that is the seed from where tarot truly sprung, is a deck of playing cards with a trump suit. That's it. Everything else is derivative. And I know a lot of people would disagree with me on that. But this is not their YouTube channel, so oh well. Sorry. Getting sassy. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about that little bit. So anyway, bearing all of this in mind, if you're coming into tarot completely green and you have no idea where you need to start and you're wondering like, oh, what should my first deck be? I'm gonna say that's a hard one. Part of me really wants to rebel and say, don't start off with the Rider-Waite-Smith. Everybody does that. And I think the reason for that right now is because it's an iconic deck. It has probably the most influence in the English-speaking world because of how popular, Waite's interpretation of the tarot was, and how influential it was at the time that it was published, and even it's not that far removed from decks that came after it, like the Thoth deck. So even though they're different systems, as it were, and they have different interpretations and different uses. They're still closer to each other than I think either of them are to the Tarot de Marseille. So it's really hard for me to say which one I think you should start with. My recommendation would be to just get a deck that you're really drawn to, that speaks to you on a spiritual level. If it just comes down to finding the deck that you think is the prettiest, then so be it. Like, just get started somewhere. Because the truth is that if you want to learn the other systems, you're going to do that of your own volition. Nobody is forcing you to do it. It's what I did. I think I bought my first deck when I was about 19, and this was after knowing what tarot was for years and knowing that I wanted to collect decks ever since I was a teenager. I bought my first Rider-Waite deck when I was 19, and then I think I was just kind of like really meh about the whole thing. and then some years later I bought myself the Revelations Tarot by the artist Zach Wong, and I bought that particularly because I wanted to know how to read reversals in tarot, and then that didn't work out for me either. So I realized up until that point I was really just buying tarot for how I thought I should get started and not necessarily out of any great passion. And sometime later, some years later, years and years, I was at witch camp and someone whipped out one of the original prints of the Light Visions Tarot, which later became the Prisma Visions Tarot. And I was absolutely so enamored by this deck. I thought it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And then when I saw the color version, I was just doubly like swooning over it. So I bought myself a copy of that deck. I started using it for daily draws, and ever since then I have been a student of tarot in one form or another, really learning the cards and getting to know them and using them regularly. So I would say go with your gut. And then if you want to get more serious into tarot study, get yourself like one of each. Get yourself a variant of the Rider-Waite, a variant of the Thoth, and a variant of the Tarot de Marseille, or another sort of like pre-Victorian period historical tarot deck that had like pip cards, and actually some decks that came before that period weren't even pip cards. They had like scenic images on the minor arcana cards. So just find yourself a deck. Just find one and dive right in. And if you want to know more, there's always more resources out there, and people are talking about tarot. Tarot study is alive and well. The tarot groups are numerous, and the people that populate them are numerous. So, you're not alone, and there will be lots of people to help you along the way, I can assure you. So anyway, that brings me at last to how I study tarot. I told you how I got started, but serious tarot study is something that I'm not good at. Study in general is just something I'm not good at. It's something that I want to be good at. So I've given myself some shortcuts and developed my own way of learning, because not everybody learns the same. But the way that I learn is I have a few tarot journals. One is for the spreads that I do for myself, and a few that I've done for others, but mainly the spreads that I do for myself. And I'll write down what each of the cards were, and the sort of roles they played in that spread or whatever, and then my personal interpretation of them. And it's just a record. It's a record of what I've done and how I can learn from it. And then I have a different journal where I journal about every single card individually. And usually that involves taking that card from every deck in my collection and writing individual notes on the images from that specific card, from that specific deck. And that really helps me build a connection, a universal theme that sort of flows between all of the decks, because every deck sort of speaks its own visual language, but they're all related to one another in some way, and then that's what I'm trying to deduce by studying each of the cards individually. And then, there are other things that I do. Actually, one of the rituals that I have when I first get a deck and add it to my collection is, especially if it comes secondhand, if it's not in a particular order, I will put it in order, and then I will look at each and every single card. And that helps me build kind of like a muscle memory so that I have an expectation for what the cards are supposed to say next, kind of thing, and then I can see how each deck interprets each card in order: the Fool, the Magician, the High Priestess, the Empress, etc. Like, I just know exactly what's supposed to come next, and that helps me sort of translate that visual language myself. And then the added variable, of course, of each deck, you're bringing its own interpretation of tarot to the table, so it's never going to be the same every single time. And I personally love that. That's like your favorite song and listening to all the covers of that song. So to me, there's an appeal in doing it that way, and that may be something that helps you as well, because there's a structure to it that I think helps you sort of build a muscle memory. And oh, just in case you're curious, the order that I put them in is I put all of the major arcana cards in order from Fool all the way to the World, and then the suits each in their sort of like respective stacks of Ace all the way to King, and then I put those in the order of Wands, Cups, Swords, and then Pentacles or coins or discs or whatever. And that's just the order that I put them in, and it's just my order. I think it's arbitrary. I think I just stuck to it after doing it so many times. So there's no like hidden significance there. Although I do think that over time I realized that I was kind of putting the minor arcana cards in what I imagine are their corresponding cards to the moon phases. So the wands represent the waxing moon, the cups are the full moon, the swords are the waning moon, and the new moon is the pentacles or coins. So yeah, that was not deliberate at first, but that's just where it's come now. So that's it for this first video on tarot. I hope you have found it informative and helpful. Oh, before I go, I want to say that I realized a few weeks ago that I passed my 500 subscriber mark. Yay! So I wanted to celebrate that doing something. So starting from this video until some to be determined time in the future, I'm going to open the floor in every comments thread on my videos and on my Facebook page for a Q&A. And you guys have this opportunity to pick my brain if there's something you want to know. I'm not sure what sort of volume I'll get, but as I said, the floor is yours. Ask away. If you want a question to be asked anonymously, hit me up on Facebook in a private message, and I can do it that way if that's something you prefer. And then we'll see how it goes. Should be fun. I will see you in the next video. And until then, everybody, I wish you very sweet dreams. Bye.